Interpretation or interpreting is the facilitating of oral or sign language communication, either simultaneously or consecutively, between users of different languages. Translation studies is the systematic study of the theory, description, and application of interpretation and translation. An interpreter is a person who converts a thought or expression in a source language into an expression with a comparable meaning in a target language, either simultaneously in real time or consecutively after one party has finished speaking. The interpreter's function is to convey every semantic element, tone, and register, and every intention and feeling of the message that the source language speaker is directing to target language recipients. Comparison to translation. Despite being used in a non-technical sense as interchangeable, interpreting and translation are not synonymous. Interpreting takes a message from a source language and renders that message into a different target language, English into French. In interpreting, the interpreter will take in a complex concept from one language, choose the most appropriate vocabulary in the target language to faithfully render the message in a linguistically, emotionally, tonally, and culturally equivalent message. Translation is the transference of meaning from text to text, written or recorded, with the translator having time and access to resources, dictionaries, glossaries, etc., to produce an accurate document or verbal artifact. Lesser known as transliteration, used within sign language interpreting. Takes one form of a language and transfer those same words into another form, spoken English, into a signed form of English, signed exact English, not ASL. In court interpreting, it is not acceptable to omit anything from the source, no matter how quickly the source speaks, since not only is accuracy a principal canon for interpreters, but mandatory. The inaccurate interpretation of even a single word in a material can totally mislead the triers of fact. The most important factor for this level of accuracy is the use of a team of 2 or more interpreters during a lengthy process, with one actively interpreting and the second monitoring for greater accuracy. Although there are many different opinions in the industry on to how to deliver the most accuracy in stressful situations, translators have time to consider and revise each word and sentence before delivering their product to the client. While live interpretation's goal is to achieve total accuracy at all times, details of the original, source, speech can be missed and interpreters can ask for clarification from the speaker. In any language, including sign languages, when a word is used for which there is no exact match, expansion may be necessary in order to fully interpret the intended meaning of the word. The English word hospitable may require several words or phrases to encompass its complex meaning. Another unique situation is when an interpreted message appears much shorter or longer than the original message. The message may appear shorter at times because of unique efficiencies within a certain language. English to Spanish is a prime example. Spanish uses gender-specific nouns, not used in English, which convey information in a more condensed package, thus requiring more words and time in an English interpretation to provide the same plethora of information. Because of situations like these, interpreting often requires a lag or processing time. This time allows the interpreter to take in subjects and verbs in order to rearrange grammar appropriately while picking accurate vocabulary before starting the message. While working with interpreters, it is important to remember lag time in order to avoid accidentally interrupting one another and to receive the entire message. Modes. Simultaneous. Simultaneous interpreters station, teleconference, at the European Court of Justice. In extempore, simultaneous interpretation, the interpreter renders the message in the target language as quickly as he or she can formulate it from the source language, while the source language speaker continuously speaks. An oral language interpreter, sitting in a soundproof booth, speaks into a microphone while clearly seeing and hearing the source language speaker via earphones. The simultaneous interpretation is rendered to the target language listeners via their earphones. Moreover, she is the common mode used by sign language interpreters, although the person using the source language, the interpreter, and the target language recipient, since either the hearing person or the deaf person may be delivering the message, must necessarily be in close proximity. The first introduction and employment of extempore simultaneous interpretation using electronic equipment that can facilitate large numbers of listeners was the Nuremberg trials with 4 official working languages. Consecutive play media. Interpreters facilitate three-way conversation among Vladimir Putin, Russian, Muammar Gaddafi, Arabic, and Muriel Mathieu, French, 2008. In consecutive interpreting. CI, the interpreter speaks after the source language speaker has finished speaking. The speech is divided in 2 segments, and the interpreter sits or stands beside the source language speaker, listening and taking notes as the speaker progresses through the message. When the speaker pauses or finishes speaking, the interpreter then renders a portion of the message, or the entire message, in the target language. Consecutive interpretation is rendered as short CI, or long CI. In short CI, the interpreter relies on memory, each message segment being brief enough to memorize. In long CI, the interpreter takes notes of the message to aid rendering long passages. These informal divisions are established with the client before the interpretation is effected, depending upon the subject, its complexity, and the purpose of the interpretation. On occasion, document sight translation is required of the interpreter during consecutive interpretation work. Sight translation combines interpretation and translation. The interpreter must render the source language document to the target language, as if it were written in the target language. Sight translation occurs usually, but not exclusively, in judicial and medical work. The CI interpreter Patricia Stocklin renders Klaus Bednar's speech to Garry Kasparov. The CI interpreter Patricia Stocklin takes notes on Garry Kasparov's speech. The CI interpreter Patricia Stocklin renders Garry Kasparov's speech to the audience. Consecutively interpreted speeches, or segments of them, tend to be short. 50 years ago, the CI interpreter would render speeches of 20 or 30 minutes. Today, 10 or 15 minutes is considered too long, particularly since audiences usually prefer not to sit through 20 minutes of speech they cannot understand. Often, if not previously advised, the source language speaker is unaware that they may speak more than a single sentence before the CI interpretation is rendered, and might stop after each sentence to await its target language rendering. Sometimes, however, depending upon the setting or subject matter, and upon the interpreter's capacity to memorize, the interpreter may ask the speaker to pause after each sentence, or after each clause. Sentence-by-sentence interpreting requires less memorization, and therefore lower likelihood for omissions, yet its disadvantage is in the interpreter's not having heard the entire speech, or its gist, and the overall message is sometimes harder to render both because of lack of context, and because of interrupted delivery. For example, imagine a joke told in bits and pieces, with breaks for translation in between. This method is often used in rendering speeches, depositions, recorded statements, court witness testimony, and medical and job interviews, but it is usually best to complete a whole idea before it is interpreted. Full, i.e., unbroken, consecutive interpreting of whole thoughts allows for the full meaning of the source language message to be understood before the interpreter renders it in the target language. This affords a truer, more accurate, and more accessible interpretation than does simultaneous interpretation. The only case in which the technique of consecutive interpretation cannot be applied is when a written speech is being read out. Written speeches are best dealt with by the reading of pre-translated texts. Whispered. In whispered interpreting. Chachadage, in French, sometimes called whispering simultaneous, the interpreter sits or stands next to the person or people requiring interpretation. A maximum of 2 people can be accommodated. Unless a microphone and headphones are used, the interpreter does not whisper, as this would after a time be taxing on the voice, making further speech impossible due to the hoarseness whispering for long periods induces. Instead, the interpreter speaks softly using normal, voiced speech kept at a low volume. The interpreter's mouth and the ear of the person listening must be in close proximity so as not to disturb the others in the room. Without electronic equipment, Chukotaj is tiring, as the interpreter's posture is affected. Simultaneous interpreting is used when people need to follow what is said in the room without themselves making a contribution, whereas consecutive interpretation is used when there is a dialogue, and perhaps people wish to hear what the original speaker said in the source language, because some of the listeners speak that language, or in a court setting, to preserve for the record the original words of the speaker when a witness or other party is questioned. Consecutive interpretation will double the time taken, as everything said in source language is repeated once again in the target language, because of the intense concentration needed by interpreters to hear every word spoken and provide an accurate rendition in the target language. Professional interpreters work in pairs or in teams of 3, so that after interpreting for 20 minutes, the interpreters switch. Relay interpreting is usually used when there are several target languages. A source language interpreter interprets the text to a language common to every interpreter, who then render the message to their respective target languages. For example, a Japanese source message first is rendered to English, to a group of interpreters, who listen to the English, and render the message into Arabic, French, and Russian, the other target languages. In heavily multilingual meetings, there may be more than one intermediate language, i.e. a Greek source language could be interpreted into English, and then from English to other languages, and, at the same time, it may also be directly interpreted into French, and from French, into yet more languages. This solution is most often used in the multilingual meetings of the EU institutions. Liaison interpreting involves relaying what is spoken to one, between two, or among many people. This can be done after a short speech, or consecutively, sentence by sentence, or as chukotaj, whispering. Aside from notes taken at the time, no equipment is used. Types. Conference interpreting is the interpretation of a conference, either simultaneously or consecutively, although the advent of multilingual meetings has consequently reduced the consecutive interpretation in the last 20 years. Conference interpretation is divided between 2 markets, the institutional and private. International institutions, EU, and EPO, etc., holding multilingual meetings, often favor interpreting several foreign languages to the interpreter's mother tongues. Local private markets tend to be bilingual meetings, the local language, plus another, and the interpreters work both into and out of their mother tongues. The markets are not mutually exclusive. The International Association of Conference Interpreters, AIIC, is the only worldwide association of conference interpreters. Founded in 1953, it assembles more than 2,800 professional conference interpreters in more than 90 countries. Judicial, legal, or court interpreting occurs in courts of justice, administrative tribunals, and wherever a legal proceeding is held, i.e., a police station, for an interrogation, a conference room, for a deposition, or the locale for taking a sworn statement. Legal interpreting can be the consecutive interpretation of witnesses' testimony, for example, or the simultaneous interpretation of entire proceedings by electronic means, for one person, or all of the people attending. The right to a competent interpreter for anyone who does not understand the language of the court, especially for the accused in a criminal trial, is usually considered a fundamental rule of justice. Therefore, this right is often guaranteed in national constitutions, declarations of rights, fundamental laws establishing the justice system, or by precedents set by the highest courts. However, it is not a constitutionally required procedure in the United States that a certified interpreter be present at police interrogation. In the U.S., depending upon the regulations and standards adhered to per state and venue, court interpreters usually work alone when interpreting consecutively, or, as a team, when interpreting simultaneously. In addition to practical mastery of the source and target languages, thorough knowledge of law and legal and court procedures is required of court interpreters. They are often required to have formal authorization from the state to work in the courts and are called certified court interpreters. In many jurisdictions, the interpretation is considered an essential part of the evidence. Incompetent interpretation, or simply failure to swear in the interpreter, can lead to a mistrial. Escort. In escort interpreting, an interpreter accompanies a person or a delegation on a tour, on a visit, or to a meeting or interview. An interpreter in this role is called an escort interpreter or an escorting interpreter. This is liaison interpreting. Public sector, also known as community interpreting, is the type of interpreting occurring in fields such as legal, health, and local government, social, housing, environmental health, education, and welfare services. In community interpreting, factors exist which determine and affect language and communication production, such as speech's emotional content, hostile or polarized social surroundings, its created stress, the power relationships among participants, and the interpreter's degree of responsibility, in many cases more than extreme. In some cases, even the life of the other person depends upon the interpreter's work. Medical interpreting is a subset of public service interpreting, consisting of communication among medical personnel and the patient and his or her family, or among medical personnel speaking different languages, facilitated by an interpreter, usually formally educated and qualified to provide such interpretation services. In some situations, medical employees who are multilingual may participate part-time as members of internal language banks. The medical interpreter must have a strong knowledge of medicine, common medical procedures, the patient interview, the medical examination processes, ethics, and the daily workings of the hospital or clinic where he or she works, in order to effectively serve both the patient and the medical personnel. Moreover, and very important, medical interpreters often are cultural liaisons for people, regardless of language, who are unfamiliar with or uncomfortable in hospital, clinical, or medical settings. For example, in China, there is no mandatory certificate for medical interpreters, as of 2012. Most interpretation in hospitals in China is done by doctors, who are proficient in both Chinese and English, mostly in his/her specialty. They interpret more in academic settings than for communications between doctors and patients. When a patient needs English language service in a Chinese hospital, more often than not the patient will be directed to a staff member in the hospital, who is recognized by his/her colleagues as proficient in English. The actual quality of such service for patients, or medical translation for communications between doctors speaking different languages, is unknown by the interpreting community, as interpreters who lack medical background rarely receive accreditation for medical translation in the medical community. Interpreters fall within the allied health professionals category of medical providers. Sign language. 2 sign language interpreters working for a school. A sign language interpreter must accurately convey messages between 2 different languages. An interpreter is therefore both deaf and hearing individuals. The act of interpreting occurs when a hearing person speaks, and an interpreter renders the speaker's meaning into sign language, or other forms used by the deaf party, i.e.s. The interpreting also happens in reverse. When a deaf person signs, an interpreter renders the meaning expressed in the signs into the oral language for the hearing party, which is sometimes referred to as voice interpreting or voicing. This may be performed either as simultaneous or consecutive interpreting. Skilled sign language interpreters will position themselves in a room or space that allows them to be seen by the deaf participants and heard clearly by hearing participants, as well as be in a position to hear and/or see the speaker or speakers clearly. In some circumstances, an interpreter may interpret from one language to another, whether that is English to British Sign Language, English to American Sign Language, Spanish to English to American Sign Language, and so on. Deaf individuals also have the opportunity to work as interpreters. The deaf individual will team with a hearing counterpart to provide interpretation for deaf individuals who may not know the same sign language used in that country. who have minimal language skills, are developmentally delayed, or have other mental and/or physical disabilities which make communication a unique challenge. In other cases, the hearing interpreter may interpret in the sign language, whichever kind of sign language the team knows, and the deaf team will then interpret into the language in which the individual can understand. They also interpret information from one medium of language into another. For example, when a person is signing visually, the deaf interpreter could be hired to copy those signs into a deaf-blind person's hand and add visual information. Most interpreters have been formally trained in an interpreter training program, ITP. ITP lengths vary, and are usually 2 or 4 years, to obtain a degree or certificate. Graduate programs are also available. In the United States, sign language interpreters have national and state-level certifications. The Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, a non-profit organization, is known for its national recognition and certification process. In addition to training requirements and stringent certification testing, the RID members must abide by a code of professional conduct, grievance process, and continuing education requirement. There are many interpreter training programs in the U.S. The Collegiate Commission on Interpreter Education is the body that accredits interpreter preparation programs. A list of accredited programs and the value of accreditation can be found on the website listed, ccieaccreditation.org web link. Europe and other countries have their own National Association of Sign Language Interpreters. Some countries have more than one national association due to regional or language differences. The European Forum of Sign Language Interpreters, EFSLI, is the umbrella organization of sign language interpreters in Europe. Media. By its very nature, media interpreting has to be conducted in the simultaneous mode. It is provided particularly for live television coverages such as press conferences, live or taped interviews with political figures, musicians, artists, sportsmen, or people from the business circle. In this type of interpreting, the interpreter has to sit in a soundproof booth, where ideally he/she can see the speakers on a monitor and the set. All equipment should be checked before recording begins. In particular, satellite connections have to be double-checked to ensure that the interpreter's voice is not sent back, and the interpreter gets to hear only one channel at a time. In the case of interviews recorded outside the studio and some current affairs program, the interpreter interprets what he or she hears on a TV monitor. Background noise can be a serious problem. The interpreter working for the media has to sound as slick and confident as a television presenter. Media interpreting has gained more visibility and presence, especially after the Gulf War. Television channels have begun to hire staff simultaneous interpreters. The interpreter renders the press conferences, telephone beepers, interviews, and similar live coverage for the viewers. It is more stressful than other types of interpreting as the interpreter has to deal with a wide range of technical problems coupled with the control room's hassle and wrangling during live coverage. Modalities. Interpreting services can be delivered in multiple modalities. The most common modality through which interpreting services are provided is on-site interpreting. On-site, also called in-person interpreting, or sometimes colloquialized as face-to-face. This delivery method requires the interpreter to be physically present in order for the interpretation to take place. In on-site interpreting settings, all of the parties who wish to speak to one another are usually located in the same place. This is by far the most common modality used for most public and social service settings. Telephone. Telephone interpreting, also referred to as over-the-phone interpreting, telephonic interpreting, and teleinterpreting. Telephone interpreting enables interpretation via telephone. The interpreter is added to a conference call. Telephone interpreting may be used in place of on-site interpreting when no on-site interpreter is readily available at the location where services are needed. However, it is more commonly used for situations in which all parties who wish to communicate are already speaking to one another via telephone, e.g. telephone applications for insurance or credit cards, or telephone inquiries from consumers to businesses. Video. A video interpreter sign used at locations offering VRS or VRI services. Video relay service and video remote interpreting. Interpretation services via video remote interpreting. VRI, or a video relay service, VRS, are useful for spoken language barriers, where visual cultural recognition is relevant, and even more applicable, where one of the parties is deaf, hard of hearing or speech impaired, mute. In such cases the interpretation flow is normally within the same principal language, such as French Sign Language, FSL, to spoken French, Spanish Sign Language, SSL, to spoken Spanish, British Sign Language, BSL, to spoken English, and American Sign Language, ASL, also to spoken English, since BSL and ASL are completely distinct, etc. Multilingual sign language interpreters, who can also translate as well across principal languages, such as to and from SSL, to and from spoken English, are also available, albeit less frequently. Such activities involve considerable effort on the part of the translator, since sign languages are distinct natural languages with their own construction and syntax, different from the oral version of the same principal language. With video interpreting, sign language interpreters work remotely with live video and audio feeds so that the interpreter can see the deaf or mute party, converse with the hearing party and vice versa. Much like telephone interpreting, video interpreting can be used for situations in which no on-site interpreters are available. However, video interpreting cannot be used for situations in which all parties are speaking via telephone alone. VRI and VRS interpretation requires all parties to have the necessary equipment. Some advanced equipment enables interpreters to control the video camera in order to zoom in and out and to point the camera toward the party that is signing. Venues. The majority of professional full-time conference interpreters work for phone interpreting agencies, healthcare institutions, courts, school systems, and international organizations like the United Nations, the European Union, or the African Union. The world's largest employer of interpreters is currently the European Commission, which employs hundreds of staff and freelance interpreters working into the official languages of the European Union. The European Union's other institutions, the European Parliament, and the European Court of Justice, have smaller interpreting services. The United Nations employs interpreters at almost all its sites throughout the world. Because it has only 6 official languages, however, it is a smaller employer than the European Union. Interpreters may also work as freelance operators in their local, regional and national communities, or may take on contract work under an interpreting business or service. They would typically take on work as described above. The U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan employ hundreds of interpreters to assist with its communications with the local population. Certifications. No worldwide testing or certification agency exists for all types of interpreters. For conference interpretation, there is the International Association of Conference Interpreters, or AIC. Specific regions, countries, or even cities will have their own certification standards. In many cases, graduates of a certain caliber university program acts as a de facto certification for conference interpretation.